Okay. So this is a webinar on how to apply for an emergency telephone charge increase. These are the things we're going to be talking about. When do you need to file an ETC application? And by the way, ETC means two different things in the Public Utility Commission's parlance, and that does cause confusion. ETC can mean an eligible telecommunications carrier application. That doesn't apply to you at all. That has to do with telecommunications providers who want to get certification to become lifeline providers or get federal broadband funds. So in this context, when I say ETC application, I'm talking about emergency telephone charge application. And I'm very careful with those, with that terminology, because in the past we've used the word 911 surcharge to mean multiple different things. Now that we have a state 911 surcharge, we have a wireless 911 wireless prepaid 911 charge, and you have your local emergency telephone charges. I want to make sure that we're differentiating between those terms. So when I say emergency telephone charge or ETC, I'm talking about your local charge that is remitted directly to you, to your governing body, by the telecommunications providers in the state. We're going to talk about timing of applications. If you've attended 911 advisory task force meetings over the course of the last year or so, you've heard me talk about when you need to file emergency telephone charge applications. It used to be that you could file them whenever you wanted, and they could have an effective date that just met the notice requirements that were in the statute. With the state 911 surcharge legislation that went into effect in 2020, however, there are now only 2 times per year that you can make a new emergency telephone charge effective. So we'll talk about the timing of applications to meet those effective dates. And then the bulk of what we're going to be talking about is using the Commission's optional emergency telephone charge application form. I'm actually going to go through the form question by question and show you the questions and talk about how you need to fill out that application form if you're using the form. I do mention that it's optional. You don't have to use the form. It is strongly recommended because it makes it a lot easier for us to review the application, and it makes it easier for you to make sure you're not missing anything that needs to be included in the application. So we really encourage you to use it, but you don't have to. You can file a free form application with the Commission, but again, the form is there for you to use if you want to. Benefits of providing a draft application prior to filing. We'll talk about what that process looks like and why it's recommended by Commission staff. Using the Commission's e-filing system. So if you've never used the Commission's e-filing system, we'll talk a little bit about that. We won't get into a lot of detail, but we'll tell you at least how to get more information. If you're having difficulty using the Commission's e-filing system, we'll show you who to reach out to for additional information. And then we'll give you a few tips for a smoother application process. And this is a smoother application process. It does not guarantee that the application will be approved. I have to be very, you'll hear me say this multiple times probably during this webinar, but I want to be very clear on this, that Commission staff does not approve emergency telephone charge applications. We review emergency telephone charge applications and we make recommendations to the Commission. Ultimately, it is the Commission, meaning the 3 commissioners that sit on the bench, that approve emergency telephone charge applications. It is not Commission staff. So when I talk about making a smoother application process, we're talking about making sure that you have all of the information that's required, that's included, and all of the information that Commission staff needs to make a recommendation, because if you don't, we're going to have to come back to you and ask you to add additional documentation to your application, which can delay the processing of the application and make it much less likely, or make it less likely, that you're going to make your preferred effective date for that emergency telephone charge change. So we'll give you some tips on making a smoother application process based on that information. And like I said with the previous webinar, if you have questions as we go through this information, go ahead and speak up. Don't necessarily save it for the end, because it'll be more relevant when I'm talking about that particular topic. We'll come back and ask for questions at the end as well. But if you have questions while we're going through it, feel free to raise your hand or just speak up, and we'll try to answer those questions right away. So when do you need to file an ETC application? Colorado statute requires that 911 governing bodies or authorities, which is the more common term, publish their emergency telephone charge rate annually. I don't think very many of the 911 authorities are frankly doing this. It has been a requirement in statutes even since before this most recent update to the legislation. And I don't know that anybody has complained ever if a 911 governing body isn't publishing their ETC rate annually. The telecommunications providers just assume that it's the same if they don't see any different from the 911 governing bodies. But if you are interested in making sure that you're following the letter of the statute, that is what it requires. Applications to increase your emergency telephone charge rate must be filed if the rate selected by the 911 governing body is above the threshold set annually by the commission. So every October 1st, the commission now determines what the threshold will be for the following calendar year. Right now, that threshold is $1.81. You'll remember that before this current legislation was passed, it was 70 cents, and the commission couldn't change it. It was just 70 cents. Now we set what that threshold is annually, and we base that. The commission bases that per statute on inflation and the needs of the governing bodies. So we look primarily at inflation. We also look at whether there's any information to indicate that cost for providing local emergency telephone service is going up faster than the rate of inflation. We can look at that data as well, so it doesn't have to be just an inflationary increase. But we do have to at least take into consideration inflation, and then ultimately it's up to the commission to determine what that threshold will be for the following year. Right now, inflation is pretty high. I can't guarantee that the commission will make a full 7.9% adjustment. Kind of depends on what inflation rate looks like at the time that the commission is making this decision. And there's no requirement that the commission do a full increase based on inflation either, even though that is one of the things that the commission is required to consider. And then whatever the commission decides by October 1st, that becomes effective on January 1st. That gets a little weird with the effective dates of the emergency telephone charge increases, because the increases are February 1st or June 1st, according to statute, but the threshold is actually in place as of January 1st. So you can watch for that on October 1st. If increasing your emergency telephone charge up to that threshold helps you, you can do that without filing an application with the commission. You only have to file an application with the commission if your emergency telephone charge rate that you wish to impose is higher than the threshold set by the commission. Does anybody have any questions on that so far? And I've covered this in previous webinars as well, so hopefully this isn't coming as a surprise to anybody. But if you're new at your governing body, or if this is a new responsibility for you, or if you've just never had to file, you've never needed to increase your emergency telephone charge before, so this is new to you, hopefully this was useful information. Timing of applications. Statute requires, as I mentioned, that emergency telephone charges become effective either February 1st or June 1st. Statute also requires that the governing body provide at least 60 days notice to carriers prior to the effective date. So if you're not having to file an application because the amount you're asking for is not above the threshold set by the commission, then that's the only timing you need to consider. You have to get notice out to the carriers prior to that, 60 days prior to the effective date. So if it's February 1st, you count back 60 days from February 1st, and that's the deadline for getting notice out to the carriers. If it's June 1st, you count back 60 days from June 1st. But then there's another time period you need to consider if it's going to require an application to the commission, because all applications to the commission, unless waived by the commission, require a 30-day comment period. Now you can ask for a expedited application process and tell the commission why you feel like an expedited application process is appropriate. But in general, a 30-day comment period is required for all applications to the commission. This means that the actual filing deadline for filing applications are November 1st for a February 1st deadline, or March 1st for a June 1st deadline. If you actually count back 60 days plus 30 days, from February 1st. You might not get exactly November 1st, but I'm giving you that date so that it gives you a little bit more leeway in making sure that you get that application filed in an appropriate manner, in an appropriate and timely manner. Very important to note, those are the last possible dates for filing an application. If there are any delays at all to approving your application, this means that it could take longer than that 30-day comment period to approve your application, which means that you will miss your proposed effective date. Because of that, I recommend that you go back a full extra month and file by October 1st for a February 1st effective date, or by February 1st for a June 1st effective date. If you file after that, we'll still consider the application, and if everything's in order, we might be able to get the commission to approve it in time for your proposed effective date. But if there are any delays, if you wait till the very last minute for that 30-day comment period and that 60-day notification period to the carriers, if there are any delays to approving the application, you're going to miss your effective date. And we are unable to give any guarantees whatsoever that if you file it by November 1st, we're going to have it approved in time for February 1st. We just can't do that because there are a lot of factors involved that can intervene in that. So the sooner you file, the better off you are in terms of getting it approved in time for your desired effective date. But no matter how early you file, there's no guarantees. And I want to make sure that people are aware of that we're not providing any guarantees of an application being approved in time for an effective date. Now, if you apply for a February 1st effective date and there are delays and you can't get it approved in time for a February 1st effective date, that doesn't mean the application is dead. It just means that when the commission approves it, you're going to have to choose a later effective date. You'll have to choose the June 1st effective date. Similarly, if you apply for a June 1st effective date and there are delays and it doesn't get approved in time for you to do those notifications to the carriers, those 60-day notifications to the carriers prior to June 1st, then it'll have to become effective the following February 1st. That's that's more than a half a year from June 1st to February 1st. That's more than a half a year of delay. That's time that you are not collecting that emergency telephone charge rate at the higher rate that you requested. So it's really in your best interest to get those filed as far in advance of those effective dates as you can. If the ETC rate you are setting is at or below the threshold set by the commission, you only need to provide the 60-day notice to carriers. Again, you don't have to file an application, which means that 30-day comment period does not apply to you. That means providing notice by December 31st for a February 1st effective date or April 1st for a June 1st effective date. Those are the very last days that you can apply or that you can send out notice rather for those increases. It is not required in statute that you notify the commission that you've changed your ETC rate, but we ask you to do that. We ask you as a courtesy to notify us when you change your ETC rate, and this will actually help you because we keep a list of all of the local emergency telephone charge rates on the 911 program website, and I know that some of the carriers check that list to make sure that they are collecting and remitting the correct amount for each 911 governing body in the state. So if we have the correct ETC rate for you, it will save you some time in chasing down those telecommunications providers that may be collecting and remitting the wrong amount to your governing body. We keep a list, and as I mentioned earlier, we also keep a map of the collection areas that we try to keep as up to date as possible. As I mentioned earlier, the form that we have for applying, yes, Matt.
Just a point of discussion, we have not been notifying the full list. We've only been notifying the carriers which remit either a form and money, or at least a form to us, rather than try to sort out all of the email address problems with that list.
Yes, so you have probably the best source of information as who's remitting to you and who's doing business in your service area. The I should mention this, the statute, by the way, used to say that notifications to the carriers had to go out by registered mail. It no longer says that. It does not specify the method for notification. So you can do it by email, which is probably the easiest and most cost-effective. If you have email addresses for all of the companies that remit to you, that's probably your best option for notifying them of a change in your emergency telephone charge rate. If you don't have a good list of all of the companies that remit to you or do business in your jurisdiction, we do have a list of carriers on the Commission's website. We get that list of carriers from the company that collects the state 911 surcharge. So it's not broken down by service area. If you send it to everybody on that list, a lot of the carriers you send it to may not even do business in your service area, but it doesn't hurt to notify them anyway, right? So I think your own information is probably your best source for sending out notifications, but if you don't have good information on your side, you can use the list that we have on the 911 program website. Although the use of the form is optional, it is highly recommended. However, if you choose not to use the form, you still need to include all of the information that's required on the form. If you want to see what a free form application looks like, we didn't used to have an actual form that the Commission provided. So applications had to be filed, had to be written in sort of a free form narrative format. If you want to see what one of those looks like, there's a lot of examples that have been filed previously with the Commission. So just send me an email and I'll send you some links so you can look at previous applications and see what those look like. However, the form is really designed to do two things. It's there to help ensure that you are including all of the information that's required in our rules, as well as all the information that Commission staff needs to do a proper analysis of the application and provide a recommendation to the Commission, as well as just to help the Commission staff, because what happens with those free-form applications is there's a lot of exhibits that are included, there's attachments that are included. We need specific information to do our analysis, and sometimes searching through all of that data that's filed with the application can be very time-consuming. It's time-consuming to do a review of an application anyway, but if we have a form that shows us exactly which exhibit we should be looking at for which specific information, it makes things a lot easier on us as well. So it's easier on you, easier on us, and that's why it is highly recommended. Get this to advance. There we go. So the first three questions on the form, and I hope this isn't too much of an eye exam for everybody out there, but the first three questions on the form are about who is filling out the application and who the contact person is for the governing body. The first question just says name and address of the applicant, the governing body. That really should just be the name of the governing body and its address. That can be a PO box, it can be a street address if the governing body has one. The second question is who is filling out this, who the representative is that's filling out this form, and who is responsible for answering inquiries related to this form. So it's the name, address, telephone number, and email address. That part is important because sometimes people seem to forget that one. Of the applicant's representative to whom all inquiries concerning the application should be made. That might be a board member. It might be the director of the PSAP, because sometimes the governing body and the PSAP kind of operate together, and maybe it's the PSAP director who's filling out this form for the governing body. Whoever is responsible for answering inquiries about this application, that's who needs to be listed here. And then the name, address, number 3 says the name, address, and telephone number and email address of the applicant's contact person for customer inquiries concerning the application. We asked for this information separately because that's what Commission rules require, and that's really based on how most of the utilities that the Commission regulates operate. They might have one person who's responsible for filing this filing an application with the Commission, but they might have a completely different person who's responsible for any customer inquiries related to the application. I think for the vast majority of governing bodies, the answer to both of these questions are the same. If that's true for you, you don't have to fill this out. Just put the word same in there, or you can just put in the same information you put in number 2. If you do have a separate person that you want to be responsible for answering customer inquiries, meaning in your case, that's your citizens, the people paying 911 emergency telephone charges in your collection area. If you want a different person responsible for answering inquiries from people in your community, that's fine too. You can put a different person in there, but I don't know that I've ever seen an emergency telephone charge application with a different person in number 3 as listed in number 2. Question 4 asks what your current ETC rate is. Again, we should already have that from that data collection form we talked about in the previous webinar, but just in case it's been updated since then and we weren't notified, this is your opportunity to tell us what your current ETC rate is, and the ETC rate being requested in the next box. We also ask what your proposed effective date for the ETC rate is, whether that's February 1st or June 1st. That's really for staff to know, okay, what are our time constraints on getting this before the commission? If we don't get it before the commission in time for a February 1st or June 1st effective date, that doesn't mean the application's dead. The commission may just direct you, say it's too late for you to do your 60-day notification to the carriers for a February 1st effective date. So we approve this application for a June 1st effective date. But it gives commission staff a little bit of information as to what our time constraints are on doing our review. Hello, Kitty. Are doing our review of the application and getting that before the commission for a decision. Number 5, this is a question that is required by commission rules, which is the town or city and any alternate town or city where applicant prefers any hearings to be held. If you've never filed an emergency telephone charge application before, this may confuse you. Most emergency telephone charge applications never end up having a hearing involved. A hearing tends to be involved if there are any intervening parties who say that they don't agree with the emergency telephone charge application increase, or if there are any really unclear, if there's really, by the time it gets before the commission, there are still a lot of unanswered questions or documentation missing. This may get referred to an administrative law judge who schedules a hearing to talk about the missing information or to gather testimony from people who may disagree with the emergency telephone charge application. 99% of the time, if a hearing is required, it's going to be at the PUC offices. But commission rules require that we ask if you want those hearings to be held somewhere else. It can be in your city town hall. It can be anywhere in your community. If you want the commission to come out to your community to do the hearing, you have the right in the application to request that, and then the commission can decide that if and when a hearing is scheduled and determined to be necessary. Even though the commission does the vast majority of its hearings at its own offices, it has in the past, depending on what type of hearing is being held, it has in the past decided to hold hearings in the field so that people who are affected by the outcome of the hearing have a greater opportunity to provide testimony. Number 6. So number 6 is really a list of items that we don't require you to provide any particular information about. We just require you to acknowledge and agree to. So the first 3 boxes on that page, and by the way, for each of these boxes, we're not requiring you to provide any information. We're just requiring you to put your initials in that box to indicate that you read it and that the person who is causing this form to be filed agrees to that statement. And most of these are standard things that every applicant to the PUC, regardless of what the application is for, has to agree to. And so they're reproduced here in the application form for an emergency telephone charge increase. So the first item just says the applicant agrees to respond to all questions propounded by commission or its staff concerning the application. So if you're agreeing that if you file this application and either the commission or commission staff has additional questions about the application, you agree to respond to those questions. The applicant shall permit the commission or any of its staff to inspect the applicant's books and records as part of the investigation into this application. To my knowledge, we have never requested that you send us all of your books to look at. We're not interested in combing through all of your finances. However, This is a standard question that the commission requires every applicant to respond to as part of an application. At most, we may ask you to send us, we'll say, we really need to see your proposed budget for the next 5 years, which is one of the things that's requested in the next question, question number 7, and you didn't include it, so send us that. We're not asking you to send us like a QuickBook file of all of your finances because that usually is not pertinent to this type of application. The next item says the applicant understands that if any portion of the application is found to be false or contain material representations, any authorities granted may be revoked upon commission order. So let's say that somebody files, this has never happened in the history of ETC applications that I'm aware of. But let's say a 911 governing body files an application and the commission approves that application for a certain emergency telephone charge rate. Let's say it's $2 because that would be above the current threshold. And then a year from now, somebody files a complaint with the commission saying that they have information that the governing body did not disclose all of its revenues in its ETC application. The fact that the application itself was either false or contained material representation because it did not include all of the pertinent information means that the commission has the authority to revoke the permission that it granted earlier, the approval that it granted earlier for that higher emergency telephone charge rate. The next item says the applicant acknowledges the following. So we're asking for your initials to agree to each of these 3 statements. The first statement is that the filing of the application does not itself constitute approval of the application. That seems pretty self-evident, but you know what they say about rules? When somebody comes up with a new rule, it's because somebody needed that rule to be in place. So apparently at some point in the future with an application to the commission, not with an ETC application that I'm aware of, but with an application to the commission, they thought, well, if I send in this application, that means I can start doing the thing that I applied for, and you can't. The application has to be approved before you have the ability to go forward with increasing your emergency telephone charge. If the application is granted, the applying governing body shall not implement the approved emergency telephone charge rate until the governing body complies with applicable commission rules and with any commissions established by the commission order granting the application. So this hasn't happened in a few years, but at some points in the past, the commission has approved a emergency telephone charge application, but with conditions. An example is if a governing body in the past said that one of the reasons we're filing for an increase in our emergency telephone charge is because we need this money to pay for X, Y, or Z. The commission may say, okay, we're approving your application, but we want reports on your progress towards approving or towards paying for the things that you said you were going to pay for with this ETC increase. The commission has the authority and right to include those types of conditions, and if they do include those types of conditions, then your application is granted conditionally based on completing those additional requirements. C is if a hearing is held, the applying governing body shall present evidence at the hearing to establish its qualifications to impose the requested emergency telephone charge rate. Again, hearings are not usually required for emergency telephone charge applications, but they're also not unheard of. There have been a number of 911 governing body 911 emergency telephone charge applications in the past that have required hearings. So there is the possibility that a hearing may be required for some future emergency telephone charge application. If a hearing is required, it will be scheduled in consultation with the emergency telephone, with the 911 governing body to make sure that that date and location works well for them. And they are also expected to attend that hearing and provide testimony in support of their application. We require a statement that within the last 18 months, the applicant has not used emergency telephone charge funds for purposes not authorized under state statute, and provides the statutory reference there, and that the planned use of all future revenues raised from emergency telephone charges are authorized by state statute. This is done primarily because the commission has the authority to approve applications based on the needs of the governing body to provide emergency telephone service. And emergency telephone service is roughly defined as allowable expenses under that statute. So if you're spending money, if you're spending any 911 or emergency telephone charge funds on purposes not allowed under statute, then that impacts the commission's ability to approve applications for additional emergency telephone charge funds. So that's that's the reason why we asked that question. And then we get into question number 7, and there are a number of items under this one as well. So before I get on to number 7, I want to pause and see if there were any questions about the items under number 6 that are just, we require somebody to provide their initials to acknowledge the statement. Okay. So number 7 is where we're asking for supporting documents, and each of these items are listed with a box next to them, and what we've asked you to put in this box is the exhibit number where we can find that information. So usually in the past, if a governing body would file an application, there would be a main application, and then in addition to that application, there would be exhibits. And those exhibits could be in whatever order the governing body chose for them to be in, which made it very difficult for commission staff to find information that we were looking for that was necessary for us to do our analysis and provide our recommendation to the commission. So the main purpose of this is to, one, make sure that the governing body is providing all of the information that's needed, not only required by commission rules, but also needed by commission staff to do our analysis, but also to help commission staff locate which exhibit each of this information is in. So the first item that we have listed here is recent financials. This is a report showing actual revenues and expenses for at least the 3 previous years. We need that information as commission staff to do a budget projection, because you're going to provide your own budget projection, but commission staff does its own budget projection based on those previous expenses as well as what your proposed future expenses are. And we do that so that we can see what your bottom line is over time to help show the commission whether or not an increase in the emergency telephone charge is actually justified by the documentation. So we ask you to tell us what exhibit number or numbers that information is in. It might be different exhibits. You might have one exhibit showing your revenues over the last few years. You might have one exhibit showing your expenses over the last 3 years. And it can be more than 3 years if you feel like that better strengthens your application. But we ask for at least 3 years, because without at least 3 years, it's very difficult to do any projections into the future. The recent financials requirement requires you to provide a report or reports that show actual, that's not projected or budgeted, expenses and revenues for the last 3 years. This is a little different than the previous one. So recent, oh no, I'm repeating myself. So this is just going over the same item that I was just talking about. This is the same item. So we're asking you to provide that information. A little bit more information on this. You should break down, this makes it a little easier for us to do our analysis. You should break down your revenues by type. That's emergency telephone charge revenue, state 911 surcharge and prepaid revenue, interest from savings or investments, and other revenue. Sometimes the budgets that we get, or the budget reports that we get that show actual expenses or actual revenues, lump all of that into one line item. That actually hurts your case, and I'll tell you why. Because when we do our projections into the future, we're going to take your existing emergency telephone charge rate, and we're going to take your proposed emergency telephone charge rate, and we're going to apply it to the emergency telephone charge revenue that you've experienced over the last several years to see what your revenues will look like in the future under the proposed rate. If you don't break those out, then we're also applying it to your state 911 surcharge and prepaid revenue, to your interest from savings or investments, or to any other revenue that you may have, which will paint a rosier picture of your future finances than reality would suggest. So the more you break that down, if you can break out ETC revenue into one line item and everything else into another line item, at least that will help with us projecting what your future revenues will be in a way that actually shows what your real future revenues will be, and it's not overly optimistic because it's applying the increase that you're requesting to other types of revenue. All right, now, actually the next item, Projected budget with requested increase. We are requesting that you provide a 5-year projected budget. This is assuming you receive your approval for the increase that you're requesting. How are you going to spend your funds? This could be exactly the same as you've been spending your money. You just now have more. You just now have enough revenue to pay for those things. Or maybe you're asking for an increase because you have costs in the future that you are budgeting for. They could be one-time costs, or they could be ongoing costs that you're wanting. Maybe you're wanting to increase the amount of money that the governing body is providing to the PSAP to pay for personnel costs. Or maybe you're wanting to provide money for training, or maybe you're wanting to provide money for maintenance agreements and other ongoing equipment type costs that you haven't paid for in the past as a governing body. These are the things that we want you to show us so that we can include that in our budget projections to see what the bottom line is. And we look out 5 years, because if we increase your emergency telephone charge rate, but that's only good enough to keep you going for a couple of years, and then you're back in again, that's not really efficient for everybody. We want an ETC application to be something that you file every once in a long time. If it's every 5 years, that seems reasonable. If you're having to file an ETC application every other year, then we probably need to be looking further out and making sure that the ETC that we are approving for you or recommending approving for you is actually sufficient to your needs for several years, so that you don't have to come in and do this every year. Because this is kind of a big deal, right? You can see just from the type of information that we're asking for that it takes some time to put one of these applications together. The commission has to be diligent and actually look at all of the information and provide a reasonable decision based on the analysis. So we have to ask for this information. But if we were requiring you to do this every other year or so, that would be really onerous. So we want to make sure that we're looking out far enough in advance that we can justify an amount that will keep you going for an extended period of time. If you want to go out further than 5 years, that's allowed too. We're requesting at least 5 years, but it doesn't have to be limited to 5 years if you want to do an 8-year budget or a 10-year budget, so that we can look at what the ETC rate would do for you over that period of time. We're willing to do that. We just request that it be at least 5 years. All proposed expenses must be allowable under 2911-104. If you have some expenses that are not allowable under 2911-104 that are being paid for by other revenues, because some 911 governing bodies have revenue sources that are not specifically related to 911 funds. Maybe you have a dedicated sales tax that you're getting money from. You can spend that money on things that aren't necessarily included in the list of allowable expenses. But if you have those, we need those separated out so that we know what's being paid for with 911 funds and what's being paid for with other funds, so that we're not looking at increasing your ETC charge to pay for things that you're not legally allowed to spend ETC money on. Documentation of budgetary line items. Request documentation of line items in excess of $50,000 per year. For some small 911 authorities, you may not have very many 911 line items or budgetary line items over $50,000 a year. For large 911 authorities, you may have several line items that are over $50,000 a year. Any line item over $50,000 a year would request additional documentation to show where that projected line item came from. For example, if you have maintenance agreements on your CAD system or your radio system or your phone system, and those together come out to over $50,000 a year, copies of those maintenance agreements and the amounts for each of those maintenance agreements would be sufficient documentation. If it's a one-time purchase of a new, like a new CAD system, for instance, a estimate from a vendor telling you how much that is likely to cost, so that we know that that estimate is based on an actual, on real life figures from an actual vendor, and not just a guess. That will go a long way towards providing us with the documentation we need. So that's really what we're talking about here. If it's something as simple as If it's something as simple as like you're giving so much money to the PSAP. So some 911 authorities, for example, will give a lump sum to one of their PSAPs to cover allowable costs under the statute. That's fine, that's allowed. But if you're going to do that, provide a copy of the PSAP's budget so we can see where that money is being spent. So if there are any questions about, well, where is this, how do we know that this money is all going towards allowable expenses? If we can see the PSAP's budget and see that they're spending at least that much every year on allowable expenses, then that answers that question. Joe provided a comment. Some agreements have confidentiality provisions. I have never seen a maintenance agreement that was not able to be filed in a ETC application. However, the commission does have confidential filing rules. If you have a document that you can't file publicly, we have a way for you to file that confidentially so that it will not be available to the public. But we obviously do have to have that documentation in order for the commission to say that it's done its due diligence and can approve that application. IGA for the governing body, so your intergovernmental agreement or equivalent document. So not every 911 governing body has an IGA. A few of the 911 governing bodies in the state, for instance, are operated by the city council or by the county commission. And it may be a county, it may be a city ordinance or a county ordinance that actually authorizes the existence of the 911 governing body. Statute is actually really broad on what a 911 governing body can be or what the structure of a 911 governing body should be. I think most governing bodies in Colorado have an intergovernmental agreement because it's multiple political entities that create the 911 governing body. But whatever that governing document is for you that authorizes the governing body to exist and to collect emergency telephone charges on behalf of the governing body, that's what we need. Because if there's any question in the future as to whether this particular organization had the legal authority to even ask for an ETC rate approval by the commission, that's one of the things that the commission would have to show that we saw. So we asked for a copy of that, and usually that's not too difficult for the governing bodies to provide. A surcharge resolution. We're asking for a resolution or equivalent decision from the governing body authorizing its agent to pursue approval of the requested emergency telephone charge. This goes into hypotheticals that have never happened, but theoretically could happen. If there were a person at a 911 governing body who said, you know, I think we need an increase to our emergency telephone charge, I'm just going to file on behalf of the governing body for an increase to our emergency telephone charge. But that increase wasn't approved by the 911 governing body's governing board itself. Or let's say it's a governing body that is essentially the same as the city council or the county commission, and the PSAP manager files for the ETC increase without getting approval first from the county commission or the city or the city council or the county commission, then that's a problem for the commission if we then approve that ETC rate, even though it wasn't authorized by the governing body that actually oversees that ETC rate. So we need some sort of some sort of documentation that the governing body, whatever that happens to be, usually it's a 911 authority board, that the governing body for that 911 governing body for the governing body, the governing entity for that 911 governing body has approved this ETC rate increase. And usually, I don't think we've ever had any problems getting that from the applicant. If there's no resolution, we've even accepted in the past. We've accepted minutes from meetings. So if there was a board meeting where the board approved the treasurer or the PSAP manager to file for an ETC application, a copy of the minutes from that board meeting showing that they approved it is sufficient as well. That's what we need. We need documentation that the governing body of the 911 authority has approved this application. We need you to include a copy of your governing body's most recent audit, or provide a link to where the audit may be found online. A lot of 911 governing bodies don't do their own audits. They don't have a separate audit just for the governing body. It might be the audit might be part of a bigger audit for the county. for the full county budget or for a city budget. Wherever the audit for your governing body exists, whether it's an independent, a separate audit, or whether it's part of a larger audit, we need a copy of that audit or a link to where that audit can be found online. Because sometimes these audits, especially if it's for a whole county, can be hundreds of pages long. A lot of people just choose to provide a link as an exhibit. They'll just have one exhibit with a link to where the audit can be found online. That is totally fine. Some governing bodies aren't required to perform audits because their budgets are under a certain threshold that require audits by state law. If that's the case, there should be some documentation that you have from the state saying that you are exempt from an audit. It could be an application that you filed with the state to make yourself exempt from an audit. So any documentation you have to provide in lieu of an audit to that end is helpful and will suffice for this. A draft public notice and publication plan. So as part of every ETC application, once the ETC application has been filed, the governing body is going to have to publish notice in a local newspaper of record that they have asked the PUC for an application and provide the public with information on how to look up that application and comment on it. In the application form itself, we have a template that you can use for doing a public notice. What we're requesting from you is that you provide us with a draft of what your public notice will say and a description of how you plan to publish it. It used to be that it had to be published in a newspaper or newspapers for 2 consecutive weeks. Now it just says now the commission rules just say 1 week. So you only have to publish it once, but we need to know where you plan on publishing it so that if the commission has any concerns that it might not be getting published in a newspaper that will be that is readily accessible to people in your community, we can provide some additional guidance on that. Do not publish your notice until staff has had a chance to review your draft. So if you provide a draft of your application to us, great, we're going to take a look at your draft notice then. But if you don't provide us a draft of your, providing us with a draft of your application before you file it is optional. So if you file your application and we haven't provided you any notice on your draft, I really, really recommend that you do not publish your notice until staff has had a chance to review your draft and let you know if there's anything missing from it. Because if there's any required information that's supposed to be in the notice that is not in the notice and you've already published it, then you may have to publish it again, which could cost you additional money if there was a fee associated with publishing that in your local newspaper. And then optional, here's an optional item. This is any supporting or explanatory documentation which may assist in the evaluation of the application. This is optional, but it's highly recommended. We really think that applications do better and that it's easier for us to evaluate them if they include a narrative. And a narrative is just a written statement that can be anything from a few paragraphs to a few pages long that explains why the governing body's ETC rate needs an increase. A lot of times the type of information we see in that narrative is stuff that's hard to put into, or it's hard to determine just from looking at numbers or looking at your revenue. It can be things like, over the last several years, our county has seen a drop in population. Maybe they're moving out of our community, and because of the drop in population, our subscriber base has gone down. Or maybe the information is, we really need to replace our phone system. Our phone system is X number of years old. It is not capable of accepting phone calls in I3 format or even IP format. We need to upgrade our phone system so that we can take calls directly from the EZNet. We want to increase our training budget so that we can train our telecommunicators, because we're going to start implementing emergency medical dispatch protocols. Whatever the information is that helps strengthen your case for why you need your ETC to be increased, that's the type of information you would include in a narrative. It can include any other type of documentation that you think is relevant. If you I've seen a couple of times 911 governing bodies, before they file for an ETC application, they may be engaged with a consultant to tell them, do we need more money, or are we spending, or do we just need to spend our money differently? And then the consultant may say, you need to spend your money differently, but you also need an ETC increase. A copy of the report from the consultant could be one of the things that you include as one of these optional supporting documents. So anything that you think will help you strengthen your case, you are more than welcome to include it. And then we ask you to put what exhibit numbers those are related to, so that we know to look at those. And that is all. That's a lot, but that is the bulk of the application. Is question number 7, where we have each of these different things, and we're asking you to provide us with the exhibit numbers that match those different things that we're asking for. So I'm going to pause here and see if anybody has any questions regarding the information that I just went over before I go on with the rest of the application. Okay. The next page of the application is a template of an affidavit. So an application to the PUC for an emergency telephone charge increase, or for any other purpose, is a legal document and has to be accompanied with an affidavit. You don't have to use the one that's in the form, but it's a template to help you if you don't know how to write an affidavit. You could use that as a starting point. And it's really just a statement. It's a written statement where you are saying, I am authorized to file this application on behalf of the governing body, and I attest that everything in it, as far as I know, is true. Right? It says, to the best of my knowledge. If it turns out there's something in there that wasn't true, but you thought it was true at the time, that's okay. That's why we say to the best of our knowledge, because there's probably nobody that knows all of the ins and outs of every 911 governing body's finances. But we ask that somebody is doing their best to provide us with accurate and complete information. And as I mentioned, there's also a page that I didn't show in here that is a draft of a public notice. That draft is there for you to look at and use to make sure that you are including all of the information that's required in the commission rules for a notice of an emergency telephone charge application. You can reword it some, but there is information in that template that has to be included because it's required in commission rules. So I encourage people not to deviate too much from that template. And you can use that template as a starting point for your public notice. And again, once you file your application, we're going to be looking at the public notice draft you included with your application to make sure that it does include all of the information that's required under commission rules. So with all that said, you don't have to do this next part. You don't have to use the form. You can file it free form, so long as it includes all of the same information. It's strongly recommended because it makes things easier for both you and us. And then another thing that's optional is providing commission staff with a draft of the application before you file it. It is strongly recommended, but it's not required. And the reason why it's recommended is because it allows us to identify any missing information and let you know what that missing information is, so you can gather and include that information with the formal application. We recognize that a lot of 911 governing bodies don't have full-time or even ongoing legal counsel. A lot of times these applications are being put together by a member of the 911 Authority Board, and they may have never filed an application with the PUC before. Filing applications with the PUC is not something that 911 governing bodies do on a regular basis, like a utility might. But it's still required by statute and by commission rules. So knowing that, we want to help make sure that what you're filing is complete so that it doesn't take additional time, because once it's filed, it becomes a little bit more of a formal process, and it can take a lot longer to get information filed into the application. So if we can tell you what's missing ahead of time, that'll make the application be processed more smoothly, and can help ensure that your actual application is processed without delay. Important, once commission staff has reviewed your draft and says, okay, it looks like everything here is in order. We don't see any missing documentation. We think that everything that you have included is that everything that's required has been included in your application, and we give you the go-ahead. That does not mean that the commission will approve the application. Again, the commissioners and not staff members decide to approve or deny any application. And when we give you the go-ahead after reviewing the draft, all we're giving you the go-ahead about is that the application is complete. We're not giving you information as to whether or not the application will be approved, because we don't have that power. That's up to the commission. But making sure that the application is complete is a very important first step, because the commission cannot approve an application that is incomplete. So that's the reason for the draft, the recommendation that you provide us with a draft of your application before filing. And most of the governing bodies these days that file applications with the commission do provide us with a draft ahead of time. That is appreciated. If you choose not to and you file an application without providing us with a draft, that doesn't hurt your application unless there's information missing. We're not going to hold that against you if you chose to go ahead and file, because that's your right under commission rules. So this is really just a courtesy both to you and to us to make sure that the application is complete before it actually gets filed. Sometimes drafts need only to be tweaked a little before they can be filed, and sometimes they need a lot of work. Sometimes we'll get a draft that is missing a lot of the information that's required in commission rules, and therefore it takes longer to get the application to where it needs to be, where we can say it is a complete application and can be filed. And that's why we recommend that you provide the application to us as much as even two months before the official filing deadline. Earlier I said that the official filing deadline is risky, because if there's any delay at all to the application being approved, then you're going to miss your 60-day notice period to the carriers. And that's why I recommended that you file it at least a month even before that, which is 4 months before the filing deadline. If you're giving us a draft ahead of that, if you give it to us 2 days before the official filing deadline, then we're not really going to have time to give you a whole lot of feedback before you have to file that application. So if you're providing us with a draft, really, if you provide it to us 2 months before the official filing deadline, which is 5 months before the effective date, that gives us time to review it and give you feedback and get you time to put together the additional documentation that we're recommending before you file it officially. So really, I think one of the biggest takeaways I hope people take from this is think ahead. Don't wait until you are desperately in need of an ETC increase before you start putting together an application. If you know you're going to need an ETC increase within the next couple of years, now is the time to start thinking about the process of putting together an application and sending us a draft so that we can provide you feedback, and then filing the application well in advance of the effective date. The e-filing system can be really obscure for people who have not used it before. Utilities who file lots of documents with the commission, including applications, are used to it. They have a person who is a designated filer on behalf of that utility. 911 governing bodies, especially 911 governing bodies that have never filed an ETC application before, this is probably your first time having to navigate the e-filing system, and it can be a learning curve. So I would encourage you to take a look at that early on in your process. If you know that you're going to be filing an ETC application, have somebody file as a registrar for your 911 governing body. There is contact information right on the e-filing page. If you have questions about how to register or how to file a document, Allison Torvik with the Colorado Public Utilities Commission is extremely helpful, and she will help you with that. And straight up, I'm just going to tell you the truth, the e-filing system is old and slow. It needs to be replaced. The commission is working on replacing this system, but when you're talking about a system that has to serve multiple industries and keep track of documents going back decades, It's not an easy process of replacing that system when it becomes obsolete. So I don't know when that's going to happen. As for now, the e-filing system that's been in place for, well, since before I came to work for the commission, before I even came to Colorado, is probably the one we're going to have for at least a couple more years. So unfortunately, that's what we're stuck with, and that's what people have to use. But we will help you if you start to look at this and say, I have absolutely no idea how to navigate this. We're here to help with that. And then on to tips for a smoother application process. So it's not listed as a requirement, but we need to know what your cash balance was at the end of the last calendar year. The commission staff, one of the first things we're going to do after you file an application, we're going to look at your surcharge revenues and your expenses over the last 3 years. We're going to look at your projected expenses over the next 5 years, because remember, that's one of the things we ask for is a 5-year projection of your expenses. And then we're going to project what your bottom line is over out to the end of that 5-year projection based on, okay, if they do get this increase, what is that going to do to their revenues based on their projected expenses? And then we're going to look at your bottom line at the end of the 5 years to see, okay, how well does this put them in the black? How well does this keep them in the black at the end of each of those 5 years? The only way we can do that is if we also know what your cash balance is at the end of the last calendar year. So even though it's not a requirement listed in the commission's rules, if you don't include that, that's one of the first things we're going to do is we're going to reach out to you and ask you to provide us with some documentation of what your cash balance was at the end of the last fiscal year. If you have a minimum cash balance that you're trying to maintain, we ask that you let us know that. Your narrative, which again is optional but highly recommended, your narrative is a good place to put that because we can try to take that minimum cash balance into account with our projections. You know, if you've got a minimum cash balance of, I'm just going to throw a number out here, $250,000, and there are a couple of years that if you don't get the increase, you're going to go below $250,000, we can take that into account. But one, we need to know that that's what your minimum cash balance is. And two, we need to know why you think that is the appropriate minimum cash balance for your governing body. It could be because $250,000 is what we would need to replace this critical piece of equipment if it suddenly stopped working. And so we want to keep that much on hand for an emergency purchase if we need it. That's a pretty good reason. Include that in your narrative, and that way we can consider that when we're doing our projections. Otherwise, we won't know that that is a decision that your governing body has made, and we won't be able to take that into consideration, which hurts you and hurts your application. At the end of the 5-year projected budget, is your ending balance close to, below, or above a reasonable cash balance? If your projected cash balance is higher than what you can justify as necessary, that might be a sign that you're asking for too much. So doing your own projection ahead of time and saying, okay, this is what we're asking for, but what does that do to our cash balance in 5 years or 8 years or 10 years, whatever projection it is we're going to provide to the commission. And if it's $3 million and you don't have a reasonable justification for having a cash balance at the end of that time period for $3 million, then maybe you're asking for too much. And so you can look at those types of things to see if that is, what you're asking for is actually a reasonable amount. It can also tell you if you're not asking for enough. And I'll tell you this right now, that if you apply for an emergency telephone charge increase and the projected budget shows that you still go in the red, even with what you're asking for a couple of times over that 5 years, we're not going to encourage you to apply for more, because that's not our job. Our job is to make sure that what you're asking for is not unreasonable. So if you do that projection and look at what your cash balance is at the end of each of those 5 years, and you're in the red, that is an indication that you either need to increase, you might need to ask for more than what you were going to apply for, or it might mean that you need to find other sources of revenue for your governing body to make a balance, a year-end balance that's in the black. What is considered a reasonable cash balance depends on the size of your governing body. If you are a very small governing body that's only taking in $100,000 a year in revenue, a reasonable cash balance probably won't be $500,000. But if you are a 911 governing body that takes in $500,000 a year, a reasonable cash balance might be $500,000. So consider that when you're looking at your cash balance at the end of each year of that budget projection, because we're going to be looking at that to see if what you're asking for is justifiable to the commission and reasonable. Pay attention to the rule that requires documentation for all projected expenses of $50,000 or more in a single year. This means quotes, maintenance agreements. It could mean a budget for the PSAP if you're just providing a lump sum to the PSAP to pay for eligible expenses. Again, that's allowed, but we would then need to see a budget for the PSAP so that we can document the fact that the PSAP is spending more than that amount of money every year in eligible expenses. Make sure that you have buy-ins. I can't stress this one enough. Make sure that you have buy-in from all of your constituent agencies. This has actually happened in the past where a 911 governing body files an application and then one of the political entities in that governing body's jurisdiction files a proceeding with files a document with the commission saying we don't agree with this increase. That makes your application look like you haven't really vetted it through all of the necessary stakeholders. And that is one of the things that could end up requiring a hearing so that we can get testimony from the parties to find out, okay, why are some people from this community saying we need an ETC increase, but the city or county is saying that we don't. So make sure you have buy-in from all of your constituent agencies. That's some of the groundwork you need to do ahead of time before you file an application with the commission. It doesn't necessarily mean that your application won't be approved, but it will definitely slow down the application process because then we will need to do a hearing. After providing us with your draft, be responsive to communication. We've had some drafts that we've received that go on for months of back and forth, and it's usually because people are not answering their emails in a timely manner. So someone will provide us with a draft. We review the draft. We try to get responses back within a week, maybe 2 weeks at the most, because sometimes these are large documents that it takes them a while to go through. We provide that feedback within a week to 2 weeks, and then it might be 2-3 months before we hear back, before they're able to gather the documentation. That doesn't hurt us. That only hurts you, because if you had a desired effective date in mind, you're probably going to miss it at that point. So when you provide us with a draft, have some sort of process in place. Say who's going to be responsive to requests from commission staff for additional documentation, who's going to be responsible for putting that documentation together and getting it to commission staff and making sure that's done in a timely manner. Again, it doesn't hurt us, although I will say that if we provide feedback and then we don't hear anything for 2 or 3 months, and then you finally provide us with additional documentation, then we have to go back and remind ourselves what we were doing and why we asked for that documentation. That can take an additional time too. And this one may seem silly, but I've actually seen this in the past. An UTC application is not a haggling process. I've seen 911 governing bodies propose an amount that was not really justified by their budgets and by their future expenses because, well, this is the highest in the state, so this is what we're going to ask for. Or we think the commission will approve this amount, so we're going to ask for $1 more than that, and so that we can negotiate down. That's not how applications on emergency telephone charges work. At least for the recommendations that staff provides to the commission, it is strictly based on what is justified in the numbers. So we're going to look at your cash balance. We're going to look at your surcharge revenue. We're going to, in the past, we're going to look at your proposed and projected expenses in the future, and we're going to see where the numbers fall out. It has nothing to do with negotiation from a high point to a middle point. It's strictly based on the numbers. So we encourage you to do the same kind of analysis ahead of time, look at your projections, and see what you think is necessary based on those projections to cover your costs, because that's what the commission staff's recommendations to the commission is going to be based on, is strictly based on the numbers. It's not based on negotiation or anything along those lines. Finally, we typically look for 3 things in an ETC application. When I say we, I'm talking about commission staff, not the commissioners. But when we make a recommendation to the commission, it's based on these 3 things. So if you keep these things in mind when you're creating your application, you will have a much better chance of success. The first thing we look at is, does the application include all of the information required by commission rules? If it doesn't, we can't even process the application. You're going to get a deficiency letter. Deficiency letter sounds a lot harsher than what it really is. It's just a list of things that are required by commission rules and are missing. That doesn't mean your application's dead, but it means you're going to have to go back and find the additional things that are required, that are in the deficiency letter, and add them as supplemental filings to the application. And so that might slow the application down. So that's the first thing we look at. Does the application include all of the information required by commission rules? Second thing is, are all proposed expenses allowed under state statute and sufficiently documented? And as I mentioned earlier, some 911 governing bodies get funding from sources other than the 3 911 funds. They get the 3 911 funds are emergency telephone charge revenues, the state 911 surcharge, and the prepaid wireless 911 charge. Money from those sources has to be spent on expenses that are allowed under state statute. That's 29.11.104. But if you get money from other sources like user agency fees or a sales tax, that money can be spent on things that we don't really have any say on here at the commission. Those are outside of our purview. So make sure, if you do that, to document what money is being used for what purposes. And because that's what we're going to be looking at. Are all proposed expenses of the emergency telephone charge allowed under statute sufficiently documented? And that sufficiently documented gets at that $50,000 documentation requirement. So any line item over $50,000, we require documentation to back up where that number came from. And then the last item is, does the information provided sufficiently demonstrate the need for the requested ETC rate? So you might include all of the documentation that's required by commission rules. You might require documentation of all of your expenses over $50,000. You might be able to document that all of your expenses are allowed under state statute. But then we look at your budget projection, and at the end of the 5-year period, you've got $5 million in the bank. So you've provided everything except sufficient demonstration that the amount you're asking for is reasonable. And you may not even know that right offhand, right? You've done your best to do a budget projection, but the commission staff is going to do its own budget projections, so our numbers might not match. That's okay. But if you can get closer to a reasonable amount to get yourself to a position at the end of that 5 years that has a reasonable cash balance, you're going to be a lot closer to being able to file that application and getting a recommendation for approval from commission staff. But remember, this is everything I just talked about is what the commission staff is doing to provide a recommendation to the commissioners. Ultimately, it's the commissioners that decide of an application, not staff. So keep in mind that we're not really the ones you have to convince. We're kind of we provide a recommendation to the commissioners, but ultimately it's the commissioners that you have to convince. So you need to provide some narrative that helps shore up that application and strengthens your request for an ETC increase. Now, if all of this sounds onerous, it is a little bit, and I think it's supposed to be. That is what statute requires, is that applications be filed with the commission, and the legislature made that requirement knowing what applications to the commission look like, and that they do require a lot of documentation, and they are a legal process. And I think that is meant to provide a break to make sure that emergency telephone charge rates in Colorado that are above that threshold are necessary. The good news is that with the same legislation that created the state 911 surcharge, the commission now has the ability to adjust that threshold annually. It used to be that anything above 70 cents required an ETC application. And almost every 911 authority in the state now, well, I wouldn't say that. A large majority of the 911 authorities in the state now have ETCs over 70 cents. So the ability to go higher than that 70 cents without filing an application, if you need the funding, obviously I'm not going to encourage anybody to increase their ETC rate if you don't need to increase your ETC rate. But if you need to increase that ETC rate to cover your eligible expenses, you can go all the way up to and including that threshold without filing an application with the commission. And I would encourage you to take a look at doing that, just keeping in mind those February 1st and June 1st effective dates, and the 60 days notice that you have to provide to the carriers before making that effective. And Jolene was going to join me today. I know not too many people have met Jolene yet. She's our new surcharge administrator. She's going to be helping a lot with the review of these applications. Unfortunately, she was out sick today and was unable to join us. But I'm hoping that you'll all be able to meet her in future meetings. And with that, I will stop and see if anybody has any questions for me. You're all either asleep because this is very dry, or I explained it in sufficient detail, and you'll have questions later when you're actually putting your ETC application together.
I think you did a fine job, Daryl. Thanks.
Thank you. Joe, I'm still working from home right now. I've heard some rumors that we may be going back to the office at least part-time, but I don't know when that will be. So I'm still working from home. But if anybody does need me, this is my office number, but it also forwards to my cell phone. So you should be able to get me unless I'm in a meeting. You can also always email me. And if I'm not able to respond by phone right away, I'm usually pretty quick at responding to questions and voicemails. Okay, well, with that, I will thank you all for your time. Oh my goodness, we're past 5 o'clock. How did that happen? I will thank you all for your time. I will be doing some editing on this and getting it on the website, and I will send out a link to everybody once it's available. So if you want to watch it again at some point, let's say you're having trouble sleeping and just need some background noise like rain or ocean sounds, or explanations on how to file an ETC application.
Or you want your attorney to hear it.
What's that?
Or you want your attorney to hear it.
Yes. And frankly, even attorneys have trouble with some of this stuff because ETC applications are just not something that a governing body has to do that often. If they have to do it very often, then they're probably not asking for enough if they're having to come back and ask for more every couple of years. So something to keep in mind. And with that, I will let you go eat dinner since it's dinner time now. And thank you for your time and your attention. And I'll get this up on the website as soon as I can.
Take care, everyone.
Thanks, Daryl.